Welcome to the Civic Pulse with David Bonior and Brian Brady. We are excited to see you this morning. Good morning. We have a great guest today. It is Dr. Andrea Bonior, a licensed clinical psychologist and professor at Georgetown University. She is a best-selling author of Detox Your Thoughts, something I need to do. Quit negative self-talk for good and discover the life you always wanted. Andrea appears regularly in national media to talk about mental health, relationship, and wellness. And most importantly, she is David's family. She is the daughter-in-law to David Bonior. Welcome.
Here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Delighted to see you guys. A lot has happened. We're going to start with a little news roundup before Andrea, you do a little therapy on me, hopefully. But a lot has happened in the last 24 hours. Syria has, the Assad regime has fallen, which is huge news. You have Trump in Paris with Macron and Zelensky trying to, with the reopening of Notre Dame. David, you had a big column in today's Michigan paper. So I'm going to toss it to the congressman real quick to give us your thoughts. You met Assad, and I bet you're secretly cheering his downfall.
Oh, more than secretly. I met him, but I also have met his father. Many years ago, I think this was in the 1980s, early 80s. I spent 4.5 hours listening to him nonstop. He doesn't let you talk in a meeting in his office. And I was with a few other elderly members of Congress as well. And for me at that time, it wasn't so bad. My bladder was young and okay. But for older people, he was noted for speaking for 7 or 8 hours at a time.
Oh yeah.
He was just unbelievable. And what he was saying it was hard not to jump in and almost want to go over there and grab him by the neck. But anyway, that was years, decades ago, almost half a century ago. But the son has been terrible. I mean, he's a war criminal. He's killed tens and tens of thousands of people, and he's responsible for that. So his fall is definitely welcomed by me. Now, I know there are people in our State Department and other places people are concerned about who may take over, but this fellow by the name of Jelani, he used to be connected to his group with Al Qaeda. They've worn that off, and now have a more moderate position. They allow women to go to college, and they're just more moderate than the rest of the Arab community right now, and that's been going on for over a year. So hopes are high that will continue, and they will develop into a more tolerant, moderate government and people. So anyway, that's one thing that's going on, and of course, they were, I think, partly successful because the Russians who have been their protector, along with the Iranians, they've been busy. They've been busy with, of course, Ukraine, and they've got a battle on their hands over there. And so a lot of these things are so interconnected, and especially in that part of the world, it's significant to note it. And I did a piece today, and I will stop with this and get your opinions and Andrea's. But I did a piece today on the possibility of peace maybe in Ukraine. And I put some ideas together from the new person that Trump has nominated, a guy by the name of Kellogg, which is an interesting name because Kellogg was the name of the sponsor of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, or better known as the Treaty of Paris, in 1928. The war to end all wars, no use of violence in wars, and it didn't work out very well. But anyway, I talk about all of his ideas, Trump's possible ideas through him, and the possibility of, a ceasefire, a zone of policing by third parties, Western countries, as well as maybe parties from BRIC, which is an alliance of Russia, China, India, and Brazil. There's one other one, South Africa, BRICS. So getting them in, getting our Western governments in on that zone, which is, as you know, you've been there, Brian, Ukraine, 600 miles. It's to police that And to have that as a demilitarized zone is not an easy task. But once that is in place, and I think that's Zelensky has made some recent comments about how he'd be open to all that, then you can build on that chassis, that infrastructure. You can build the rest of the car and see how it comes out. So I'm cautiously, very cautiously, hopeful that something will come of that.
Yeah. Andrea, we were not Trump lovers, but there does seem to be a window of opportunity for him and his people to strike a deal right here. And Andrea, war-torn zone. David and I went to Ukraine to study mental health. What is the key for? I mean, people and countries are not completely different, right? Recovering from trauma of war. Syria's lost 500,000 people, and many of them tortured. Have you studied this issue at all, and how people recover from?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's unimaginable, the scale, right? And so I think it's really interesting because so many of the ways that we conceptualize trauma and PTSD are typically on an individual level. We think of someone who's suffered something by themselves almost, or maybe a family has suffered. But when you start thinking about places where suffering severe trauma is actually the norm, we're talking about an entirely different question in terms of how we intervene, how we treat, how we even conceptualize it as a disorder, right? I mean, is it a mental health disorder when an entire community of people have it? And actually with PTSD, sometimes even the idea of thinking of it as a disorder rather than just a natural reaction to horrific circumstances, even that can be complicated. So I think we're still trying to figure out exactly how to address massive trauma. And we've certainly seen it before, but we've also historically not been good about it, at least in the United States. And certainly, David has spoken to this very eloquently and how we've abandoned veterans, how we have not paid attention to mental health problems within, veterans who die by suicide at higher rates than they die in combat. And so I think we don't have easy answers, but we do know that awareness is a first step, and that being able to help folks build community, to feel connected, to feel a sense of purpose, to get the resources that they need so that their immediate safety is taken care of. It's very hard to treat PTSD when the traumas are still coming, obviously. And if somebody is still under threat, still under danger, you can't even really begin the healing process in a significant way, right? So all of these levels take different types of intervention. The logistical intervention of getting people safe, getting people the resources to escape if they need to escape somewhere. And then the community resources of being able to help people find social support. And then ideally some individual support on the trauma level. But it's really hard to get to that point if the other things aren't in place.
Yeah.
Do you believe? Yeah.
Go ahead. Go, please.
No, do you all believe in generational trauma? That I'm married to a Ukrainian, and food is how they show love, and it makes me think of the food insecurity too that they've had at times, and the starvation the Russians did to them. That they're still living out 100 years later the trauma of that food insecurity, that culture, and do you believe that is part of the nation can have basically a psychology and a general trauma that they've all shared?
I do think that very much, and I think it gets collectively passed down just emotionally, from parent to child. I think we've seen that, certainly, in the United States in terms of slavery and in terms of other atrocities. But what's really interesting is I think the science is starting to uncover even some biological underpinnings of this. So, we know that certain genes can sort of get marked with certain types of trauma. It could be that, if your great grandparent was in a famine, that actually, created sort of a protein that wrapped around his genes that eventually got passed down to you. And this is an entirely different way of thinking about things. Epigenetics, it doesn't even necessarily take a mutation. So the biological underpinnings of this, that maybe the way that your appetite works is slightly different because you had a great grandparent in a famine. That is the type of stuff that's being explored. So I think it's fascinating. And I think there is something to it. But even if there weren't the biological underpinnings, I think the way that we continue generations and what our own traumas are can very much be passed down.
That's fascinating. David, you're an old political pro, so I think you're processing the stress of this moment a little differently than the regular people like me who are just amateur political people. I saw a baby crying in a restaurant, and I turned to the parent. I said, "Yeah, that's how I've been feeling since November 6th. It's a liberal town, so everybody laughed." But there's a sense of general doom and gloom for the progressive set about what just occurred, and also a lot of this also, I think, the mental health challenges, the news media today, and when to go on, when to consume, whether to go on social media. I know you still treat patients. What do you advise folks in these days to be a good citizen, but also to be healthy and protect your mental health?
Yeah, this balance is really tough, and it's a work in progress for everyone right now, I think, and it's a work in progress for me. I'm living it out too, and I think we've seen this a few times before when things have felt so uncertain and so horrific, right? I think early in the pandemic, there were certain elements of it that echoed this, which is we don't know how long this is going to last and how bad it's going to be, and we feel like we're under threat, right? It's a fundamentally sort of nervous system activating place to be, this threat. And we like certainty. So the uncertainty of it is almost worse than if some specifics that were bad were actually laid out and we had time to prepare for them. So I think everybody has to strike a balance. But I think the most important thing to start with is to recognize and observe what your habits are that actually feel empowering versus which make you feel more spiraling. So for some people, if they were to do a total news embargo, even just for a couple days, that would feel really disempowering because I think they would feel like they don't know what's going on. So it would feel even more uncertain. And I firmly believe we need to bear witness, right? I don't think we should turn away because I think that can get complicit. I don't think we should turn away completely. However, I think for a lot of folks, the amount of consumption of news and social media was no longer doing any good. There was a point at which, whether it is the second hour on social media, whether it is the third hour of watching cable news, whatever it might be, that is no longer actually making them more likely to be able to feel autonomous and make a difference, right? So if we burn ourselves out, then we can't go out there and act. We can't go out there and live in accordance with our values. So all of us, I do think, have a different point. And so the first step is observing yourself. What do I notice? And what small steps can I take? And with a lot of clients right now, I'm working really, really on what we consider values work. What is important to you? Here's what you can't control yet. Here's what you don't know yet. But is it compassion? Is it small action? Is it justice? Is it just, learning and curiosity? Is it empathy? Is it love for your children? Whatever it might be, let's put that into place because there is some interesting new data even saying that focusing on your values, and especially as those values might apply to others, can make us feel more empowered. So, if I'm feeling really terrified about what might happen January 20th in terms of any number of things, what I can focus on is that if I want to be a compassionate neighbor and it's getting cold and I want to make sure I check in on my elderly neighbor to make sure that their heat is working and maybe bring over some dessert for the holidays, that actually can give me a feeling like I'm making a small difference. And ultimately, the small differences matter more than we give them credit for.
David, you've dealt with highs and lows. How do you process?
Well, that's a good question because for me, I'm a little different in the sense that I've been involved in a lot of issues internationally as well as domestically. So through my political life, which has been most of my life, because my father was in politics and I followed it as a young person and followed his travails in it. For me, it's been kind of constant, even after my tough elections that I had over my career, or the partners that I was hoping that would win the presidency, the vice presidency, if they didn't win. There was always something the next day that I had been working on that was significant, whether it was in Central America or now is in Ukraine. So it's been kind of, and I have to learn, I've been learning actually in the last 3 weeks that I'm different in a little bit in that sense. Maybe that gene that what you talked about, Andrea, got into me in some way, and I'm part of that. But anyway, I've learned different techniques to deal with the stress. And for instance, at home here, Judy doesn't like the fact that I have cable on through most of the day. So I've learned to shut it down. I don't listen. I don't watch it. I don't listen to it, except when I do, because when I have some sense of what the hell is going on. I will turn the sound off, the mute off, and which is interesting in itself by watching how they conduct themselves just by their body rather than their voice. Yeah. But anyway, I do that, and I put the captions on.
Oh yeah,
you can hear what they're saying. So anyway, everybody has techniques to deal with all of this, and it's important to develop them because we live in a very stressful time where this will continue, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think it's such an interesting comment about how you've been so involved internationally that it also gives you perspective, in a way, sort of an awful kind of knowledge that there's always atrocities happening.
Yeah.
Right? Which in another way, though, actually makes it even more urgent that we find a way to manage our own lives where we're living in accordance with our values and doing the things that we need to be doing for our own lives. Because I think it's easy to assume that, oh, if it weren't for just this election, then, nothing else is as horrific. And the truth is, we don't have to look far worldwide to be horrific. And what's interesting is that I think it's part of the human spirit to be able to find a way to persist nonetheless, right? And I think we weren't necessarily evolutionarily designed to be aware of the levels of atrocities worldwide and now carry them around in our pocket all the time, right? If you think about evolutionarily, we knew what was going on with our tribe and maybe a neighboring tribe, and that was it. I don't know that our brains and nervous systems were meant to really be able to take in universal types of horrors. And so we do have to be careful, because I do feel strongly that if we burn out, we're no good to anyone. And I can think of, actually when Russia first invaded Ukraine, I remember that week in therapy, I had a client who said, hey, I got a new job I'm really excited about, but I feel awful being happy about it because of what's going on in the world. And I had another client who said, hey, I'm really upset about this situation with my husband, but I feel awful being upset because folks in Ukraine have so much more to worry about. And I thought how fundamentally in both directions, it's kind of invalidating, right? It's like when we really stop allowing ourselves to feel stuff because we think that we shouldn't, I think that's where we get into problems. And I'm not saying don't be grateful that we don't have worse problems, but I think what happens to us typically in these times is we try to not actually engage with the feelings because we feel like we don't have a right to them. And the truth is, we have a right to all the feelings, right? And we have to manage ourselves so that we can actually choose action that's going to make a difference in the ways that we want to make a difference.
And I agree with you. I think you were saying that it's important to create space where you're away from. And I do that. I mean, we all do that. We do that through exercise or through different reading materials, or as you pointed out in a great example, taking care of a neighbor, bringing them something that they need or helping them. It's important to incorporate that into your lives as you move forward.
I want to dig a little deeper too into another current event that happened that I think has psychological and spiritual ramifications, and it was a little frightening, which was the murder of Brian Thompson, the United Health executive. And then I don't know how David doesn't spend as much time as I do online. in the social media sphere. And I don't know, Andrea, if you do, but the reaction online for a lot of the lessons I follow are a little bit fringy, but not totally fringy. A lot of was kind of celebratory that he got what he deserved, right? This vigilante justice against the healthcare executive. You know, so it gets at these root emotions. And so I love to get, David, you were studying to be a priest when you were a young man. This to me is a really interesting societal question. And Andrea, how do you analyze what's happening? And David, how do you react to this?
Yeah.
Andrea, go ahead.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I was really disheartened to see some of the reactions because, I mean, I think from a political standpoint, and obviously I'm not the expert in the room on that, but something really seems to be happening that seems more potentially sort of urgent and dire. You know, I've seen a lot of people sort of evoke the kind of French Revolution idea now. And, you know, from a psychological perspective, what bothered me is that there did seem to be a sense in some of those more celebratory types of messaging that the humanity was gone, you know, because the number one thing I kept thinking, and you know, I work in mental health care. So if anyone wants to vent about insurance companies, I'll give you 10 hours of venting and be right alongside you. However, what I kept thinking about was the humanity of this individual's family having millions of people watch his murder and see memes created, see, you know, little snarky types of comments created about that. And from a human to human perspective, I firmly believe that we should not stoop to that level, no matter what folks believe. To me, that represents something dark. And I know a lot of people feel like, you know, if this is part of a larger revolution, it must happen for these all of that aside, I just can't imagine how much compounded the trauma is for, say, his children, or his wife, to be part of that whole vortex. Even if you try to avoid it, there's no way not to see it. You know, that to me was really disheartening. And I wish that we could have the conversations, but I think people feel helpless. They feel like, hey, we've been trying to fix insurance for years. And, you know, anybody who's had a heartbreaking situation of their own, and they really do feel that maybe they had a loved one that was murdered by an insurance company. And I can understand that and empathize with that. But to me, and I, you know, I'm a nonviolent person in general. So to me, that was disheartening to add that layer on top of it, to justify murder in that way, let alone to celebrate it. I think we've lost a little bit of the sight of that this is a human being with loved ones that don't deserve that level of trauma on top of their grief right now.
Yeah, amen to that. I think you're absolutely right. And we live in a very violent society with guns here in this country, and I'm a little nervous about where we're evolving with regard to this idea of violence being in any way acceptable. I don't agree with that. I'm a nonviolent person as well. I don't believe in the death penalty even. Though I think they ought to take people like these criminals like Putin and Assad and get them before the International Commission, Criminal Commission Court, and put them away for the rest of their lives. But I'm not into violence begetting more violence. Doesn't get you where you want to be as a people and as a country and as an individual, certainly.
Exactly. Yeah, I think the rage just multiplies online. I do think we're dealing with sort of a contagion of such ire that is really frightening. And I gotta say, I think there's a little hypocrisy because I know some folks that are also against the death penalty who somehow seem to be celebrating a murder of someone. So I don't get how those two things can be juxtaposed. But
yeah, and Brian Thompson's a creature of our economic systems and decisions to not have a public option on insurance, right? So should we murder everybody who killed the public option many decades ago, or it just seems like Thompson's just a creature of our system, right? Let's end on this algorithmic technology question, because I do think it's changed the nature. I read a quote after the election that the arc of history bends towards, instead of justice, the algorithm. And kind of a snarky but powerful joke. As someone who spends a lot of time online and gets addicted at times to the social media feeds because they understand my brain better than I do in some ways. And to see David and I are going to dive into this topic later, so maybe you can give us the manosphere, right? Men went for Trump, and the Trump campaign brilliantly targeted them in their streams. And the New York Times had a piece this week about how with less money, they got more bang for their advertising dollars through micro-targeting. And a lot of it's with these men age 18 to 40, right? Yeah. So I'm leaving with a lot of questions, but how do we become intelligent, how do we not let the algorithm win and actually have our own independent identity? And as a progressives, how do we fight against the algorithmic manipulations?
So much there. I wish I had a more hopeful answer to end on, right? I mean, again, I do think it comes down to awareness. You know, a lot of people who I think want to minimize the risks of the world that we're in right now technologically say like, oh, well, every new technology, there were people who said it would be the downfall of civilization, the telegraph, and I think what we need to realize is that the telegraph or arcade games or whatever other things people are saying were not designed by neuroscientists to be addictive, right? I actually see smartphones as more akin to cigarettes than to the telegraph, in terms of that you have bands of people, experts, working as hard as possible for a profit motive in order to make you need this product in an addictive way. A product that we know, if it's used in the wrong ways excessively, is harmful to health. And so the short answer, I think, is continuing the dialogue in a nuanced way. I think a lot of parents, for instance, want to give up because they feel like, oh, any screen time is probably bad, so I should just give up and let my kid have unfettered access to a smartphone, because what's the use, if any? And it's not true that any screen time is bad, right? I mean, we're having this conversation digitally. Thank goodness. We probably wouldn't be able to schedule time to be in the same room together. So I think awareness that we can have a nuanced conversation and that we need caution. And looking at the data, we know that violence and fear spread more than hopeful messaging, than complicated, nuanced, thoughtful discussions. And so we have to do our part to keep putting complicated, nuanced, thoughtful discussions into the ether instead of just passively liking the stuff that is meant to evoke a reaction. AI makes this that much more difficult, right? And so I think these algorithms are very quickly knowing us better than we know ourselves, as you said, and sometimes setting it aside as much as possible through whatever means. You know, I mean, we still do have the ability to set screen limits on Apple phones, for instance, for ourselves. We still can physically shut our phone off. You know, there's all kinds of tricks. Making your screen black and white, that actually makes apps less compelling. We're less likely to click on them instead of actually installing the app of a social media. Make yourself log in each time. That's just an extra step. And then again, noticing yourself. How did I feel after I was on, Twitter or X for 40 minutes? Do I actually feel more agitated now, or do I feel like I truly learned something? And social media is not a monolith. The algorithms aren't a monolith. Sometimes Christmas shopping, it's like, oh my God, that's the perfect product for someone. But really recognizing that these things are done with a profit motive in mind. And we've got to reject that by being able to say, I personally am going to take a stand, even when it's hard, because I'd rather be scrolling right now because I'm bored. Right. And when we notice our triggers, it's easier to not scroll. If we know, hey, I'm bored right now, let me have a list of 10 things at the ready that I can do the next time I'm bored, or the next time I'm lonely, or the next time I'm just kind of too tired to actually do professional work, so I just want to zone out. Let's have other things in line that we can do. And maybe we're on our screens for a bit, but limits are important.
I needed that good advice because I definitely escape into the social media when I'm emotionally running or just tired. Yes, especially if I fall into it.
Yeah.
David, cable TV is addictive, but I think it's a whole nother level. These social media feeds.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Well, this is a perfect introduction. I think David and I are pretty interested. There was good news in Australia, in my opinion, that they can't really enforce this, but they banned social media for age under 16, right? Which we've seen, as you said, Andrea, it's like this is not the invention of the telegraph. It's more akin to the tobacco. I love that analogy. Well, let's wrap it here. I think we could go on and talk about this topic. I have about 10 more questions here for you, but I know it's Sunday morning and we have to have some things to do. So thank you so much, Dr. Andrea Bonior, for joining David and I.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. And most of all, thanks for having these conversations. It's been such a delight to be able to hear these conversations happening, and I'm just grateful for them.
And we'd love to have you back. And I think since you're David's daughter-in-law, we might have a shot to rebook.
Anytime.
Thanks so much. Have a great day.
Have a great week.
Thank you.